Of course, under the rules of baseball, you're allowed to apply for reinstatement, which Pete Rose did many a time. Denied, denied, denied. Pete Rose recently passed away, and news came out that shocked the world. I love, Coco, when baseball news is pushed to my phone on the New York Times and Fox and CNN, the AP, ESPN, everybody. Big news. Pete Rose, eligible for the Hall of Fame. Pete Rose removed from the permanently ineligible list. And Shoeless Joe Jackson? That's what I was sent. That Pete Rose and Shoeless Joe Jackson. I was saying, oh, is there something going on that's a little different than what I thought the commissioner had been thinking of for the past 10 years? It can't be. Why would he just choose those two? Is there something going on with gambling? Well, here's what actually happened. Commissioner Rob Manfred, since before he was commissioner, where he was being voted on, when he was running to be commissioner, the issue of Pete Rose and his status was a topic of conversation. A topic of conversation that I personally had with him at the time he was running to be commissioner. What was clear is that Bart Giamatti, the father of Paul Giamatti, the actor, and another man who may come up in this show later, had done an investigation and been commissioner and assigned a penalty to Pete Rose for gambling on baseball. This is before there were deals with DraftKings. This is the third rail of sports. Worse than drugs, worse than violence, gambling on the sport when you are a participant. He was an active manager betting on games. Bart Giamatti, at 51 years old, dies of a heart attack. When Bud Selig became commissioner, one thing was clear. He was not going to go back on Bart Giamatti's decision ever. Bud Selig made it clear to the owners and the team presidents, don't talk about it because it's not happening on my watch. When Bud Selig was going to retire and there was an interesting process that ended with Rob Manfred becoming commissioner, one of the issues was, Rob, what's your view of Pete Rose? And Rob was pretty clear. I really have no interest in this Pete Rose issue when there are far bigger fish to fry, because Pete Rose forgets showing remorse. Pete Rose, in all of his applications for reinstatement, Pete Rose, in all of his actions while he was alive, did nothing but make it worse, never made it better, never made a compelling case, never did anything that made Rob say, oh, I'm going to call Bud right now because I'm going to explain to Bud that I think Pete Rose should be reinstated. Never happened. What the commissioner did do is allow for Pete Rose to participate in events on field in Cincinnati, participate as part of all-star games, as part of looking back on the history of the game. But there was never a question that he would be removed from the permanently ineligible list, which is where you go when you do bad things. The whole purpose of deterrence is that you know once you've done it, you're done. So act accordingly. Pete Rose dies. Pete Rose's family and lawyer eventually and immediately, I could have been before burial, has a meeting with Rob Manfred, who grants him the meeting, and says, what about now? And Pete Rose's legacy is in the balance. His legacy from 6 feet under. Rob Manfred says, all right, thank you. I will consider this. Rob Manfred then meets with Donald Trump after Donald Trump, the president, tweets that Pete Rose should be in the Hall of Fame and that he's going to pardon Pete Rose and make it happen. Just to be clear, there are 3 branches of government: the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. Not one of those three branches, not one, has any power at all over who's in the Hall of Fame. Nor do they have any power into who's on the permanently ineligible list or who's taken off the list. None. However, the executive branch certainly has power over leagues and other issues, which is why leagues, including baseball and football and the NBA, all have lobbying arms having nothing to do with Trump. People right now in the media are saying, oh, he met with Donald Trump, Rob Manfred did. Donald Trump was threatening baseball owners, saying, hey, you better be in the Hall of Fame. And all of a sudden, Rob Manfred releases a statement saying Pete Rose is off the permanently ineligible list. That must be correlation. Rob Manfred's been talking about this well before Trump was even president. The first time. What actually happened yesterday is not what's being reported. Rob Manfred made a decision. The benefit of the decision is that he can look Donald Trump in the eyes and say, look, I understood what you said at the meeting. I have taken all the action I can take. I can't put Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame. Only the Hall of Fame can put Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame, and they've got a system that we don't control. Sorry, my eyes were winking. There are committees that Jane Forbes Clark, the head of the Hall of Fame, the owner of the Hall of Fame, there are committees that involve writers and former players and executives, MLB officials. There are systems in place for people to be considered who did not get in solely in the first 10 years where only baseball writers have the vote. It's a system that existed before Pete Rose. It's been tweaked. It will exist long after Pete Rose, and it will still always be tweaked. But the concept is when a player retires, spends 5 years consecutively retired, baseball writers who get a vote in the Hall of Fame can vote for a player once that player is put on the ballot by a committee, by the way. That's why when the Hall of Fame ballot is released every year, it's interesting to see who's on the ballot. You've got to get 5% of writers to vote for you, or else your name falls off the ballot. You have 10 years to get 75%. Hard stop. Once that happens, no 75% or no 5% in a year, you're off the ballot. You can't be elected into the Hall of Fame by the writers. But there is then an opportunity for these, what used to be called era committees, veterans committees, new era committees. These committees meet on a rotating basis, and they consider players, executives, umpires who may have been overlooked by the writers to try to fix mistakes that writers may have made, in theory. When a player is on the permanently ineligible list, that player is not eligible to be on any Hall of Fame ballot, which can then be considered by whatever group would be considering that particular ballot. What Rob Manfred always was thinking of doing was removing Pete Rose from that permanently ineligible list, but he was never going to remove just Pete Rose. He was never going to remove him while he was alive because gambling is more of a third rail today than it ever has been. And the way the commissioner did it puts the B in brilliant. And you know, I've been critical of people and things they do, statements they make. You can't remove Pete Rose from the permanently ineligible list because he's dead and not remove everybody else who's on that list who's also croaked. So Rob Manfred made the decision that he was going to remove everybody from the permanently ineligible list who has already died. And his view is you can no longer violate Rule 21, the gambling rule. You can no longer hurt the integrity of the game. You can no longer do anything bad because you're dead. Therefore, the rule stays. You've been permanently disallowed, permanently made ineligible to participate. Once you're dead, you cannot participate anyway. The query that I had overnight, which is one of the reasons why I've got bags under my eyes, is what happens if Pete Rose were Walt Disney and decided to freeze himself, and technology changes and Pete Rose comes back to life? What if he somehow rises from the grave? Does that mean that he's back on the permanently ineligible list? Or is he off the list? And if he happens to be reborn, that becomes a new problem? Because now what we're saying is death is the end. And by making death the end, you have been able to maintain Bart Giamatti's credibility. You've been able to maintain Bud Selig's desire to maintain Bart Giamatti's credibility. You've been able to tell today's players, contrary to what some people in the media are saying today, you are be able to still tell today's players, don't you dare, because when we say permanently ineligible, we mean it.